My name is Dr. Rebecca Naden. I'm the Director of Global Risks and Resilience at the ODI, a think tank based in London. It's my pleasure to welcome you all, which promises to be actually a very engaging event on the importance of anticipating crisis and taking early action in fragile and conflict-affected states. Before we begin, I would like to thank the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office for hosting our discussion this afternoon, and also a special thanks to the FCDO's Food and Agricultural Research team. Ladies and gentlemen, people living in places which are fragile or affected by conflict are amongst some of the most vulnerable and least able to adapt to climate change. The factors which drive fragility, socio-economic and political marginalisation, land and resource tenure insecurity or corruption are socially created, and also some of the factors that increase climate vulnerability. Our problem is that our current adaptation approaches and planning is more suitable for stable areas. It does not fit the compound crisis and conflict histories of fragile areas. And it's these complex and protracted crises that further erode assets and capacities at the individual and national level, making it harder to manage climate shocks and to enact climate adaptation programmes. In fact, of the 25 countries which are most vulnerable to and least ready to adapt to climate change, more than half are affected by conflict. So, what we see is the more unstable a state, the less climate finance it receives. In addition, conflict-affected individuals and communities are often limited in their ability to act ahead of events through constraints such as lack of access to credit and finance and weakened social networks. So, why are early warning systems and anticipatory actions so important in these contexts? Well, it's because they can provide communities with critical time to prepare for disasters and reduce disaster losses. We all know that prevention is better than reaction. Indeed, the World Bank estimates that upgrading early warning and early action capacity in all developing countries can save an average of 20,000 lives per year and avoid losses worth between $300 million per year. At today's event, we aim to demonstrate that we cannot keep relying on humanitarian finance as the sole response to climate-induced crisis. We need to crowd in more resources to scale up anticipatory action and implement long-term investments for disaster risk reduction and adaptation to protect people's lives and livelihoods in the face of current and future disaster and climate risk. So I'm delighted to invite our first speaker, the Right Honourable Lord Zach Goldsmith, to give a keynote address. Lord Goldsmith is the Minister of State for Overseas Territories, Commonwealth, Energy, Climate and Environment at the FCDO. Lord Goldsmith, I hope you can introduce the issues we're facing and what sort of actions the UK is undertaking to improve early anticipatory action as part of development work. Lord Goldsmith, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thanks everyone for being here. Good afternoon. And apologies if I think I was late. So if I was, I wasn't. Okay. I feel like I'm late at everything in COP27. Look, good afternoon. In a world facing so many global challenges, it is probably tempting, well, we know it's tempting for some decision makers to defer taking action against climate change and the destruction of the natural world. But the reality is that we just simply cannot afford to do that, because whether it's food security or energy security or conflict or displacement, climate change and environmental degradation are inevitably going to exacerbate those challenges and cause more of them. Example, destroying mangroves removes a natural and highly effective protection for coastal communities, or removing forests has the effect both of exacerbating drought in the dry months and causing floods in the rainy ones. Congo Basin provides up to 2/3 of the rainfall for the entire continent of Africa. You lose the Congo Basin, you lose the rainfall, then you lose the agriculture, and then you have a humanitarian crisis on a scale that exceeds anything we've seen at any point in our history. Now, in truth, the implications of climate change and environmental degradation, particularly for the world's poorest communities, dwarf the challenges we face today. Dwarf, for example, the challenge that we faced of COVID. Frightening though it was, damaging though it was nothing compared to even the most modest predictions in relation to climate change and environmental degradation. So all around the world, more and more people are already living with the effects of climate change, and things are becoming measurably worse. Some of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change are fragile, riven by conflict, with vulnerable populations already at breaking point, many already forced to leave their homes. Countries like Somalia, like South Sudan, like Niger, like Chad, Afghanistan, Mali, and so on. There is significant financial commitment to support those vulnerable embedded within the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. But that support is too often not reaching the most vulnerable people, especially those living in conflict zones for obvious reasons, and those with the highest levels of pre-existing humanitarian need. Humanitarian programs are facing record funding gaps as global needs outpace the pledges that have been made. And because too often there's been an absence of early intervention, we see low-income countries in a state of crisis becoming even more reliant on humanitarian assistance, and that cycle has to end. We know beyond doubt that targeted development and climate finance can make all the difference in making communities more resilient, better able to withstand the shocks when they happen. So supporting communities in the worst affected areas with resilient water infrastructure or climate-smart agriculture, or nature-based solutions more generally, can make the difference between life and death, between a family staying in their home or choosing to leave in search of safer ground. All this requires an international effort, and the UK is fully committed to stepping up to tackle the greatest threats that we all face. We've doubled our international climate finance to 11.6 billion. We've committed to spending at least £3 billion of that on nature-based solutions, on restoring those natural systems that we all depend upon. And that commitment was reiterated by our Prime Minister just a couple of days ago. And it's set out in our international development strategy as well, where we repeat and emphasize our commitment to supporting those most in need and most at risk through our humanitarian assistance. And although finance clearly is a key part of the solution, so too is political commitment, realizing the urgency, working better together, adapting existing approaches to make them work better. And I hope that today's event will provide us with an opportunity to renew our commitment to support the most vulnerable communities affected by the crisis. And I know that we're going to be hearing some excellent examples of cutting-edge research, effective policy making, and resilience building. And it's only by working together, by learning from our shared experiences, will we be able to tackle our planet's greatest threat and build resilience to climate change across the world. And it's my pleasure to return the mic back to Rebecca. I can't see Rebecca. And I look forward to hearing what is said on the panel. Thank you to our panel. I said I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel, but I'm told I've got to go. So I apologize. But I will be getting a report from my colleagues. I'm so sorry I can't stay. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lord Goldsmith. So it was good there, I think, to hear Lord Goldsmith reaffirm the UK's commitment to support early action. And as we heard, he touched upon that commitment from the UK to double its international climate finance to £11.6 billion. It's now my great honour to introduce our second speaker, His Excellency Ahmad Mathobe Nunal, who is the Minister of Agriculture and Irrigation for Somalia, a country which is regrettably very familiar with the impacts of climate change. And Somalia is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change in the world, is experiencing some really truly frightening weather-related events. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear colleagues and excellencies, dear guests, good afternoon. Somalia is indeed one of the most vulnerable countries to climate crisis in the world. While contributing very little to the global climate crisis itself, Somalia is impacted much more than any other country and is in the front line of climate change with increased recurrence in climate shocks. The frequency has increased, notably in the last 10 years, with communities experiencing either flood, drought, or locust infestation. With the current trend and future prediction, more frequent environmental shocks are expected with increased severity and impact across the country. For instance, as we speak now, Somalia is facing the 5th consecutive failed rainy seasons, which has triggered the worst drought in many years. Significant number of the population is in IPC emergency phase classification, and there is a massive internal displacement of the rural population into the towns. Therefore, climate volatility is a new normal in Somalia, as we have some form of climate shocks with different levels of severity in most of the years. Unfortunately, in the fragile and conflict context of Somalia, these recurrent shocks have devastating impacts in the lives and livelihoods of rural communities. This calls for putting in place stronger early warning systems and anticipatory action mechanism to ensure that communities' lives and livelihoods are protected well in advance before disaster hits. And given the magnitude and frequency of the problem, the current early systems we have is very much limited. And now let me turn to financing. To date, Somalia has received little or no climate financing. In this regard, there's urgent call to address the aforementioned predictable needs and challenges through predictable climate financing, such as productive safety nets and strengthening government-led early warning systems. Additionally, there is need for investing in recovery and development through a robust capital injection, climate adaptation, resilience, and harnessing the productive sectors of the economy, i.e. agriculture, livestock, and fisheries. At COP27, more than ever, it should be evident that we need to build the resilience of the agricultural rural communities in the face of recurrent climate crisis. The drought-affected rural communities are the human face of the global climate emergency that we are facing. As humanitarian response focuses on saving lives, there is equally a critical need to invest in long-term, i.e. livelihoods, resilience, agriculture infrastructure development, climate adaptation, integrated water management, and disaster risk reduction to ensure that those affected can adapt and thrive in the future. There is also need for funds to address key drivers of the underlying vulnerability of affected communities through smart agricultural technologies. But the big challenge we have is, unfortunately, Somalia being a fragile and conflict-affected state, the present climate finance mechanism locks countries like mine to address climate adaptation, to access climate adaptation finance. And we cannot wait until the situation improves and we become fully stable. As a result, climate financing mechanism needs to rethink their conventional approach to financing fragile and conflict-affected states in order to scale up their access to climate finance. Finally, we need long-term adaptation projects that can transition fragile and conflict-affected states' economies from donor-dependent to market-driven, export-oriented, clean energy-powered and circular economies. Climate change, my dear friends, is real, and it is time we act now. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I think you make some very important points. As we've all known for a long time, Somalia is extremely vulnerable to climate change. But as His Excellency pointed out, yes, humanitarian assistance, but what's really needed is more of that long-term solution. So how do we scale up the access to climate finance for a country such as Somalia, so that long-term adaptation and economic development options can be developed there. I'd now like to turn to my second speaker, who's from Niger. Niger is also a country at the forefront of climate impacts and is also affected by transboundary conflict and displacement. I'm sharing the panel for the second time today with His Excellency Ali Betty, who's High Commissioner and founder of the 3 Ns. So the 3 Ns is a fantastic intervention, and I really hope His Excellency can introduce this to us and the work that Niger is doing. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting us to this exchange. Talking about anticipation of crisis and early action in fragile areas affected by civil insecurity. Talking about the situation of Niger, I want to share the situation of Niger. Niger has a long history of food, pastoral and nutrition crisis linked to poor wet season, notably the crisis of the early 70s, early 90s, 80s, and recently 2005, 2012, and 2021. The crises are all the more felt as 80% of the population is occupied by rural plant and animal production in a predominantly rural country, where the majority of the poor are rural and are women. The current climatic drift has made this risk of a food crisis even more acute and has increased the uncertainties of the effort to manage early warning systems. This situation justifies the positioning of the sector of food security, nutrition, and sustainable agricultural development to the heart of national priorities, especially since 2011, with the adoption of the 3N initiative, aimed to achieving the zero hunger objective, sustainable improvement of food and nutrition security, and the increase of the share of this sector in GDP. To this climatic crisis factor are added some crisis factors such as civil insecurity. There is thus an overlap of food and nutrition insecurity with civil insecurity, particularly on the borders of neighbor countries such as Nigeria, with Boko Haram, Mali, Burkina Faso, with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, Libya, etc. This interrelation creates a vicious circle of civil insecurity, food insecurity, poverty, and violence. The overlapping of several crisis factors weakens the context and disrupts the implementation of public policies, particularly in the rural sector. The development of agriculture, pastoralism, forestry, and the fishery sectors is slowed down, even though these sectors constitute the major source of wealth, jobs, and growth for the country. Other structural difficulties are linked to specific living conditions in pastoral and agro-pastoral areas, also affected by the effect of climate change, with difficulties in accessing basic social services and insufficiently inclusive local governance method. Pastoral and agro-pastoral area thus tend to provide fertile ground for the development of armed terrorist groups living on crimes and offenses of all kinds. States are therefore faced with the challenge of anticipating crises and implementing early measures to mitigate the effect of crisis and shock and to prevent an uncontrollable deterioration of situation. To face these challenges, the government elaborated the 3N initiative, Nigerian Nourishing Nigerians. It is a national strategy for food and nutrition, security and sustainable agricultural development. It comes to an exhaustive and long-term response to the recurrence of the food crisis and to the structural food and nutrition deficit that characterize the national economy and mark Nigerian society. The action plan of the strategy is implemented by different ministries such as agriculture, forestry, livestock ministry, water and sanitation ministry, health ministry, trade ministry, and industrial ministries, and others partners of the government. The 3N initiative is designed around 5 strategic axes covering complementary areas that constitute the specificity of the strategy. First of them, the increase and diversification of agro-silvopastoral and fishery production. The second is the regular supply of rural and urban markets with agricultural and agri-food products. Third is improving the resilience of population to climate change, crisis, and disasters. Number 4 is improvement of the nutritional status of Nigerian men and women. And the 5th is coordination of the 3N initiative and impetus for reform. The main feature of the result of the first 10 years of 3N implementation is increase the agricultural GDP by 86%, reduction of rural poverty by 10%, 10 point, increase in irrigated area, doubling the irrigated area, multiplying by 6 the counter-season irrigated production to the equivalent of cereal. 1 million hectares of degraded land recovered. All the overall level of activities in the agricultural sector and the food economy, there is an emergence of a new perspective of young people and women who are increasingly involved in production, processing, and related trade of agricultural production. But as you can imagine, there is a lack of budget or funds to implement the various activities related to 3N initiative and Nigeria's climate change strategy. If the massive portion of the national budget was not required to fight terrorism and ensure security of population, as it is the situation now, our result and performance would have been very important. President Bazoum is doing his best to find a balance at a very difficult time. So Niger addresses the issues of the prevention and management of crises and disasters through Axis 3 of the 3N initiative strategy called Improving the Resilience of Population in the Face of Climate Change, Crisis and Disaster, and settled the National Crisis and Disaster Anticipation Mechanism at a strategic and political level and at operational level. Because a good anticipatory mechanism makes it possible to take the right early measure to minimize the consequence of crisis and facilitate the transition to recovery and stabilization. And the early warning system allow good anticipation of preventing of shock and crisis. Opposite the national mechanism for anticipation crises and disasters, there is a national mechanism for rapid response to shock, crisis, and disaster implemented by various national administrations. To conclude, thanks to effective coordination between the government system and the humanitarian response plan of the UN, the crisis announced at the end of 2021 wet season, for example, could be contained. And since 2018, the government has been making effort to make the humanitarian development peace nexus approach effective through the country. The area in which Niger expects support to improve its mechanism of anticipation and early response to crisis can be summarized as better national integration of system and mechanism, accelerated digitalization of system and mechanism, increased community coverage of systems, better consideration of pastoral areas and communities by system and mechanism with better consideration of pastoral mobility in anticipating crisis and taking early measures to sufficiently reduce the severity of impact in advanced crisis and shocks. The Nexus humanitarian development peace approach is therefore a means of optimizing anticipation and early response to crisis by working together. The humanitarian development peace Nexus approach is also a means of accelerating of action to improve governance, create local and national capacities more quickly to take charge of policies, strategies, and plans, attract private investment and innovative financing solely because of the competence and credibility of institutional and individual actors. We must help elected officials and the state to play their leadership role to ensure that all actors work together and that accountability becomes the rule that govern the relationship between all governmental and non-governmental actors. Strong local authorities will facilitate action and investment, will facilitate the maintenance of the state and structuring investments in fragile areas. Finally, I want to say the real and massive support to the most vulnerable countries to the climate change is a condition for the planet to be less at risk, to be safe. Otherwise, we are all going to lose because the crisis will no longer have borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and for reminding us again that countries are dealing with lots of different shocks and threats. It's quite easy sometimes at the COPs to think that countries are only dealing with climate change, but as we've heard from the two speakers today, they're dealing with climate, conflict, food security, growing populations, the need to ensure economic jobs and growth. Also, thanks for highlighting the 3 Ends initiative, and we hope that events like this will also give it some publicity to enable others to learn from that example. At COP26, we actually saw some increase in investment for early warning systems, and we saw support across various components of early warning and response value chain. But I think we would all agree that we still need to shift a little bit to reach the scale that's needed. So on this theme, I'd like to turn to our third speaker, Zinta Zommers, from the Humanitarians Officer at UN OCHA, to give some remarks. UN OCHA is seeing again the impacts of climate change every day in its work, and certainly the increased frequency and intensity of climate-related risks is adding to the already heavy humanitarian caseload around the world. So, Ms. Somers, can you give us some context about the work that OCHA is doing and to anticipate shocks in fragile contexts, and how we might actually be able to scale this up to meet the needs, as we have just heard from Niger and Somalia?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to participate in this discussion, which I hope will help us find ways to better support communities in need. As mentioned, I represent the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA for short. We're on the front lines responding to extreme weather-related emergencies, helping coordinate the humanitarian response. As is mentioned, the number of people affected by extreme weather-related events has doubled over the past 2 decades. And fragile and conflict-affected states are highly vulnerable. In fact, of the 15 most highly vulnerable, climate-vulnerable countries, 12 have humanitarian response plans in 2022. So, as is mentioned, the climate crisis and the humanitarian crisis are largely overlapping. Anticipatory action, which might be strengthening dikes ahead of a flood, or distributing drought-resistant seeds ahead of a drought, prepositioning food, is an example of how we can avert and minimize losses and damages of extreme weather. It's also more dignified and faster than traditional humanitarian response. With support from our partners, such as the UK, OCHA's worked to scale anticipatory action, designing 12 pilots since 2020 and committing $140,000 of the Central Emergency Response Fund, or CERF. Over the past 2 years, since July of 2020, we've been able to reach 3.4 million people in 6 countries, in Bangladesh, Nepal, Ethiopia, Niger, Somalia, and South Sudan. For example, in July of 2020, severe floods were forecast in Bangladesh, and CERF released funding 4 hours after a pre-agreed trigger was met. So by the time the water reached life-threatening levels, over 220,000 people had already received assistance. In South Sudan, we've seen several years of unprecedented flooding. And this year, in May, CERF distributed $15 million to minimize the devastating impacts of this rainy season. And we hope that this funding will help over 100,000 people in an IDP camp, Bentu, prepare and minimize the floods that are actually occurring right now. And finally, in August of this year, CERF released $9.5 million ahead of drought in Niger. Many of you say, well, we haven't heard of this drought yet, but it's expected that the food insecurity will be high next year, and communities can now already take action. Going forward, OCHA would like to work to scale up these activities, but we recognize that we're only one small part of a much larger picture, a much larger suite of actions that has been mentioned by previous speakers here today. So I'd like to end with 3 calls for action, which largely reiterate calls that have been made. But first, we need to collectively address the root causes of risk, vulnerability, and exposure. There's only so much that the aid community can do alone, and we need to work more collaboratively across the nexus with humanitarian, development, peace, and climate spheres. We've already begun to share lessons and to work together to reduce risk and vulnerability. And as an example, in Burkina Faso, the humanitarian development and climate community have worked to increase the disaster risk reduction capacities of various institutions. Our anticipatory action framework in Burkina Faso also includes activities to improve education for girls, which isn't often considered a humanitarian response, but does have long-term benefits in helping reduce risk. Second, to improve our ability to predict and act on these emergencies, we need to expand early warning systems to anticipate the storms, the heat waves, the floods, and the droughts. And this includes working to improve data collection in fragile and conflict-affected states. In South Sudan this year, when we were working to try to design anticipatory action activities, we were challenged by a lack of forecasts for floods. And finally, as has been mentioned, in order to have impact, we need to scale these activities. It's been fantastic that OCHA has been able to scale the forecast-based finance innovations that partners such as IFRC have started to reach 220,000 people or 100,000 people. But we need to reach many more people. And for that, we need funding. So as the Secretary General has called for, and as our emergency relief coordinator called for earlier this week, we need more money for adaptation. We also need additional and stable or sustained funding to address loss and damages. But critically, we need to make sure this funding reaches the most fragile and most vulnerable places and reaches it quickly, not in 6 years, but in 4 hours. The humanitarian community can play a role in this, but we also need to work with all of you. So we look forward to doing that, and we hope that together we can build resilience in fragile and conflict-affected states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sommer. I think you made some very important points there. Absolutely, anticipatory action cannot be treated as a standalone activity, but it needs to work alongside and be integrated with crisis preparedness, disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. And also I think your point about investing in data and access to data for climate risk management, including adaptation, is crucial. And of course, financing. And this brings me on to our fourth speaker. So investments such as data for climate risk management adaptation, this is crucial to help governments and businesses and aid actors anticipate disasters such as droughts and floods, and also to better prepare for those long-term changes. But as we have heard, this requires money. This requires finance to flow to these conflict-affected countries. And what we've seen through the work of ODI, ICRC and others, that actually some of those existing donor requirements to access this climate finance are very complex. They're very rigid for conflict-affected countries. And they don't seem to allow that flexibility to account for those rapidly changing contexts of crisis and fragility. So we see that the modalities of accessing finance actually need to be simplified and better adapted. So I'm going to put my fourth speaker on the spot, and hopefully he's got all the answers to those issues. So I'm delighted to introduce Mahat Asoyuti, who's the Senior Climate Change Specialist with the Adaptation Fund. So the Adaptation Fund, as we know, is an important initiative working on the issues of financing in fragility. Mr. Abzuti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca. I don't know if I have all the answers, but I will try. So first of all, thanks to the UK government and ODI inviting us to share our perspective on this issue. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. The Adaptation Fund is one of the climate funds that are serving the Paris Agreement, and we have been set up 15 years ago under the Kyoto Protocol. The issue of fragility and conflict settings and how we mobilize climate finance in this region is very important. I mean, over the last 15 years, we have managed to cover more than 100 countries. And more than 50% of those countries are either LDCs or SEEDs. So, and among those, many are in either fragile or conflict settings. And the Adaptation Fund serves countries on a basis of country ownership. And we believe that what we provide as adaptation finance should be first and foremost address the local issues. So the issue of local-led adaptation is something that the Adaptation Fund has been funding since the beginning. There are different ways countries can work with the Adaptation Fund. Obviously, the first one is to implement their climate actions, and that is done through national implementing entities, which the Adaptation Fund has pioneered as an access modality. We do recognize that in some contexts, like the fragile and conflict settings, some of this access modality can be challenging for countries. And building capacity is something that the Adaptation Fund has been initiated since the beginning. We have a readiness program that helps countries to build local capacity in terms of either accessing climate finance, but also coming up with some project that can be easily presented to the fund. So this is one way. The other way that we've done, and that has been the case for the last 5 years, which was the period for the medium-term strategy of the Adaptation Fund, is through the action of enhanced direct access. So through this enhanced direct access, countries can mobilize funding which can be executed at the very local level. I mean, that has a dual objective. One is to help countries to build capacity on the ground. At least some of the local actors, like the municipalities, like the communities on the ground, they can decide what kind of actions they want to implement to address the adaptation issues, but also they can gain capacity for the long term. So at the end of the project, they will be in a position to implement and manage the project themselves. This is one way. The other way that we believe is quite important is the issue of innovation. I mean, in some of these countries, adaptation, and again, I mean, let's agree that adaptation is a local issue. I mean, there is no way to address adaptation if you don't look at what is working on the ground. And we believe that some of the local communities, including the indigenous people, have some solutions that are very innovative. And although there is a need to scale this funding, innovation can be something that it can leapfrog the adaptation benefits. So there is a window that the Adaptation Fund has been mobilized for innovation. On a personal note, I'm coming from Chad myself, which is a country known for fragility and conflict setting. I know how this situation can exacerbate the climate impact. I mean, when you have issues of fragility and conflict, and on top of that you put adaptation issue, I mean, the situation can be very, very difficult for people on the ground. And we do hear the feedback about how climate finance should be mobilized in a faster, streamlined ways in these countries. And the fund has been hearing from the countries, and we are committed to advance this discussion on how to make sure that the finance on adaptation doesn't remain only on some mid-income countries or some of these advanced countries. So thanks again for inviting us in this conversation, and we remain engaged to advance this work. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. And thank you, yes, again, for raising the importance of local-based adaptation and the importance of local communities being able to access the funds. We heard also that from Ms. Zoma about that importance of communities being able to access the money as needed. And actually, earlier this morning, I was on a panel with His Excellency Ali Betian. He talked about the importance of dignity and being able to access these funds quickly to meet the needs on the ground is also about giving people and enabling people to ensure dignity in the face of these crises. So that's very important, to put a human dimension back into some of these discussions. So finally, last but not least, I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Debbie Palmer, who's the Director of Energy, Climate and Environment Department at the FCDO, and to share more about the work that the UK is doing to support countries and communities.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Good afternoon, Excellencies. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I feel like, to be honest, I've got the easiest job because so much has already been said. And there has been an extraordinary amount of consensus, I think, amongst the panel members as we reinforce each other. And actually, that alone gives me a lot of hope that we can start moving this conversation forward. And today's event obviously is giving us that opportunity to reflect on the opportunities and the challenges. But if I may, several panelists have said this, but to step back, you know, we are at such a critical moment if we look at what's happening in the current global context. As others have said, my colleague from OCHA, you know, global food insecurity and the risk of famine is at an all-time high. We know that that's driven by conflict. We know that that's partly as a result of the COVID pandemic, but we know that one of the really serious underlying drivers is what's happening in terms of climate stresses. So we've now got 300 million people estimated to be in need of humanitarian assistance. We know that that number of people who are one step away from famine has grown since over the last 2 years, from 25 million to 49 million. And we know that excellencies here from Somalia, Chad, elsewhere, are experiencing the brunt of that as we see what's happening in the Horn, in the Central Sahel, as well as places like Yemen and Afghanistan. So really we are at a critical juncture. We can see that there is a record level of need, but there is a growing gap between the needs and the available funding. And I think that really does set the context for our conversation as we come together this afternoon. As Lord Goldsmith has already flagged, the UK is very proud. In 2019, we doubled our commitment to climate finance to 11.6 billion. And we've made a set of other commitments since then. And rolling forward, earlier this year, we published a new UK international development strategy. And that was a very important document for us because it set out the UK's commitment to act ahead of crises and support countries and communities to manage those crises better, but recognising that rapidly changing climate and the extreme weather events that we've seen around the world in the past year alone mean that it's more and more crucial than ever to take early action and to take anticipatory action, to build up the resilience of communities, to build up the preparedness of communities. And this is really local work before disaster strikes, before crises unfold. So for me, this is not just about more money, although that is important and I don't want to underplay it, but it's also about being much smarter with our financing, being smarter about the way we're engaging diplomatically. Our colleague from OCHA talked about the importance of data for climate risk management, so putting in place some of the tools and the toolkits we need, but also ensuring we're working with the international system to develop more effective responses, including a shift towards, as I said, anticipatory action, but also a toolkit of preventive instruments that we can be using, that we've practiced, that we all know how to use, and that we're moving forward. And we need to make this shift everywhere, but especially for the fragile and conflict-affected countries that are most affected by this concatenation of crises. So the UN supporting this kind of shift through our support to the UN CERF, that's the Central Emergency Response Fund, which, as we've already heard this afternoon, is pioneering a wide range of initiatives on anticipatory action. We're also funding the Red Cross and civil society to strengthen their anticipatory approaches to humanitarian assistance. And I'm really delighted to say that here at COP27, we have reaffirmed our support to the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership. That's the REAP. For those of us who are familiar with it. And that aims at making 1 billion people safer from disasters. So that's, for me, that's a real lodestar. We need to be aiming big, we need to be aiming high, and the UK government is in this space. So as I said, we know that scaling up is not just about support to the humanitarian system. We also need to connect different instruments, including, for example, disaster risk finance insurance. And that's why the UK has committed £120 million to help build the systems needed to reach poorer people quicker when disasters hit, and to bolster the regional risk pools that are providing disaster protection schemes. And those are working now across Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and indeed the Pacific. So again, we're beginning to see these toolkits come together, which is really important. We need anticipatory action to be integrated as a key component of building resilience. So I suppose one of the bear traps we all need to work through in the next few years, ensuring that it is not considered as a sort of separate set of humanitarian activities, but actually that we're building together the collaboration and we're strengthening the synergies across both anticipatory action and the work in the humanitarian space, but also climate action more broadly. So we're continuing to support this approach through programs, including in the Sahel, for example, the Sahel Shock Responsive Program. That's something very close to my heart. I've been working on it for the last 4 years. We've been delivering with the World Bank across the central Sahel, and this helps the most vulnerable households in Niger, Chad, Mali and Mauritania to adapt to the impacts of climate change, including by supporting government capabilities for this kind of anticipatory action that we've been talking about this afternoon. During COP26 and the UK's presidency, we gave adaptation and loss and damage greater prominence than at any previous COP, and the Glasgow Climate Pact recognises the urgency of scaling up to support early warning and early action. But we know that still some of the most vulnerable people are not yet reached by international climate finance. We know that fragile and conflict-affected states, often those with the highest levels of humanitarian need, are of course amongst the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I think every panellist this afternoon has underscored that point. And so we know that those are the countries that face the greatest barriers in accessing climate finance. And that really is where we need to focus our efforts. So increasing, yes, the volume of finance, but also the accessibility of that finance by these countries and these populations is the central task for us. So in summary, to strengthen the anticipatory action, for me, we need to do 4 things. We need to improve coherence, we need to increase coordination, we need to strengthen our analysis of need and make sure we've got that toolkit that we can use and the data to be able to do what we need to do in the right places for the right people. And we also need to increase access to adaptation finance for the most vulnerable. So as a UK representative, I just want to say we really look forward to working together to support this shift towards developing resilience. We're really grateful to the panellists for coming together today and for all of you to coming to join this conversation. This is an area where we'll be focused over the next few years, ensuring that we reach the most vulnerable populations, helping them to adapt to the challenges that they're facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Palmer, and thank you for that summary of what the UK has been doing. And I think, as you said, it's not just about scaling up, it's about access to finance. So that brings us, sadly, to the end of our event, but I hope you all agree we've heard a range of perspectives about the latest international work that's going on in early action and anticipatory action. But as Ms Palmer says, it's really important that that doesn't become a standalone agenda, that this actually needs to be integrated into broader initiatives. We've heard about national level projects and the importance of that, as well as transboundary and cross-sector adaptation and humanitarian initiatives. So without wanting to sort of keep repeating what the panels have said, I just want to sort of pull together what I think are the kind of sort of clear, resounding messages that we've heard, and I think you'll all agree actually keep repeating these messages is actually what we need to be doing. So absolutely, we need to scale up, we need to enable better access for finance to support adaptation objectives. The word urgent, is used a lot at the COPs, but I hope you would agree that we've really heard the evidence today that underpins that call for action, and how anticipatory action can really help build resilience before crises start. And secondly, I think we've really heard it loud and clear, the need to address these structural divisions that actually we've created ourselves. It's the bureaucracies that we've created, the processes that we've created, so it's in our gift to change them. and really employ our expertise across all sectors. So we need to combine that tremendous experience of humanitarians who are very familiar with the risks and context of operating in unstable areas with the ability of the climate and development actors to create those tailored long-term adaptation solutions. And I think we've really heard the importance that we cannot rely on humanitarian aid as the sole response to climate-induced crises. We need to again scale up, create access, think about long-term investments for disaster risk reduction, economic growth and adaptation to really help people cope with those climate-induced crises. And basically, fundamentally, it's about reducing the human and economic costs of disasters. So I hope you will all join me in thanking our guest speakers today who've given their time to come and share their thoughts and ideas. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.